Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Wild Shape is cool. Unfortunately, the scaling of the feature, if you play the Wild Shape Focus Moon Druid, is wacky. At second level, it's broken good. Then it scales terribly afterwards. So by the higher single digit levels, you might wonder, where did I go wrong with my build? Now it is not necessarily your build where you went wrong, because that's just the mechanics of the feature letting you down. But that doesn't mean there aren't build decisions we can make that can help offset this. Patreon plug time. If you would consider supporting this channel, please click the link in the video description. Patrons see these videos early and without YouTube ads. Additional perks depend on your level of support. Today I'd like to recognize and thank my mage level patrons. Alex C., Hey Mr. Wonderful, Alexander Tinkov, Babrak, Blue Wolf, Blue Eyes White 7, Brian Delgado, Condor, John D., Descarvis 9, El Conquistadorito, Eric H., Falcon Neal, Glenn Wilson, Hannah Hutchins, Jay Good, James Janish, Jared Huberger, John Hugdahl, John Wayne, Joseph Hall, Joseph Robideau, Wu Carl Kong, Lila Corpsegrave, Makatu, Lone Pilgrim, Maddie, Michael Michelle, Moxie, Nemo, Prometheo NTG, Purge Thunder, Reichenstahl, Ryan Wilmot, Shane and Todd Beyond, Taftash, Earshine, Third, Valentin, and Vo. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. I've been talking about Wild Shape build decisions for a while now. First, I went over the iconic Barbarian build that does really well at the levels where Wild Shape does well anyways, but it falls off a cliff at level 5. Then I went over how Wild Shape works, or to be more precise, how understanding how it works isn't such an easy proposition. Then, what forms for your Wild Shape are best, and what race you can choose to better enhance the Wild Shape feature. That leaves feats, multiclassing, and spells. Today let's look at what feats work well with Wild Shape. That's probably the smallest of those three topics. If you're making a druid focused on Wild Shape and plan to play that druid into higher levels, we need to carefully consider our build options including feats to remain effective. Which is why with Wild Shape there's so much detail to cover. A lot of our go-to feats just aren't working well with Wild Shape, like Polar Master, Great Weapon Master. So it's important to look at the restrictions of Wild Shape and see which feats still pack a punch. Also, we want to look at what feats might actually get better if we're Wild Shaped. I'm going to start this list with some feat options that I maybe just consider interesting. As in, I think the combination of these feats with Wild Shape really changes the dynamics of these feats, and they warrant looking at in a different way than we normally would. But, then I'll move on to the options that I think are particularly strong. Tough. I want to address this one because I think there's probably some question whether it works in Wild Shape or not. Like if you Wild Shape into a bear, do you add twice your level to the bear's maximum hit point total? I figure if I didn't include this feat, it would show up in the comments section asking why I didn't include it. I don't personally think it works. Here's why. It says that you get the bonus to your hit point maximum when you take this feat. I think that means it adds to your base hit points for your character, but it wouldn't be added again while Wild Shaped. Still, I'm not 100% sure. So if you do want to add a comment about tough, instead of asking why I didn't include it, you can share your opinion on whether you think it should apply to Wild Shape forms or not. On the same line of thought, the Hill Dwarves' Dwarven Toughness probably falls in my same pool of things I think probably don't carry over to Wild Shape, but I'm not 100% sure. Dwarven Fortitude. So this one, it's iffy because the drawback is obviously that you have to play a dwarf. And I wouldn't rank the dwarf among the top races you can choose for a Wild Shaping druid. But if you do end up with a dwarf character, then Dwarven Fortitude works better for a Wild Shaping character than any other character. And what it comes down to is how hit dice work. When you take the dodge action in combat, you can expend a hit die to heal yourself, just like if you spent that hit die during a short rest. But if you're Wild Shaped, you aren't using your own hit dice. You are using the hit dice of the creature you Wild Shaped into. Hit dice are a resource you're getting when you're Wild Shaped that you normally aren't getting to use. But here we have a pretty decent use of it for significant self-healing. This dodge action is limited to when you're in combat though, and dodging is probably not your normal combat action. I would consider doing it though if I'm in that cleanup phase of a combat where our victory is basically assured, Or perhaps if I was just straight out tanking and the enemies are beating up on me, to get a little bit more out of my wild shape form. This feat is definitely not something I'd consider must-have feat for a wild shaper, but it's at least worth looking at. Savage Attacker. Wait, did I just say Savage Attacker? Let me check my notes. Here it is, Savage Attacker. It is on my list. This is only on my list because when I went through the feat list, I was being very thorough. Because normally, I pass right by this one without pause. Savage Attacker is not a good feat. Let's read it again because I bet a lot of you haven't read this one in a long time. I sure hadn't. Once per turn, when you roll damage for a melee attack, you can reroll the weapon's damage dice and use either total. So if we're playing a standard weapon-using character, this is awful. Once per turn means it doesn't play nicely with extra attack, action surge, bonus action attacks, or any other option that provides you additional attacks on your turn. Mainly though, it just doesn't have much impact. When we use a weapon, the weapon's damage die or dice just aren't the primary source of damage. When we're adding ability score modifiers, sneak attacks, smites, great weapon master or sharpshooter bonuses, and more. So even if we roll poorly on our weapon's damage die, a reroll probably means a small increase in our overall damage. So even when we get to use this feat, it's not having a big impact. Now, depending what wild shape form we take, this could be equally bad for us. But there are certain forms that make one big attack, and the natural weapon damage dice can be the vast majority of the damage we deal. Here's an example. The Giant Elk is a CR2 form, meaning a Moon Druid could wild shape into a Giant Elk at level 6 or higher. Attacks with hooves deal an average of 22 damage, and a whopping 82% of that damage is based on the 48 natural weapon damage dice. If you roll unlucky damage on that attack, Savage Attacker could easily double your damage or more. Of course, if you score a critical hit, the potential to increase damage from Savage Attacker is even greater. Now, just like with Dwarven Fortitude, I'm not sure this is a feat I would run to with a wild shape character, but again, it's a feat I normally wouldn't even think about. But with wild shape, its value does improve to the point where I think it could be okay. I have one more feat that I think I normally would never consider that gains a whole lot of value with wild shape Druid, to the point where I think it's actually a pretty good selection. Gift of the Chromatic Dragon. So this provides two benefits. The first is we can touch a simpler martial weapon as a bonus action and infuse it with one of several damage types, and then it inflicts an additional d4 damage of that type for the next minute. Now I know you're typing right now, natural weapons don't count as simpler martial weapons. And let me just say, you're right. But that doesn't mean this part of the feat isn't useful, because I'll point out it doesn't suggest that weapon we enhance has to be our own weapon. Mr. Hand Crossbow in your party is going to be very glad for you to give them this d4 boost. And a bonus action is usually very doable for a wild shape character, as a lot of our forms don't have bonus action options. So this part of the feature carries over just fine. The reason we would consider this, though, is for part 2, Reactive Resistance. As a druid, we probably have the Absorb Element spell, but when you're wild shaped, that doesn't do you any good. Being able to use your reaction to get resistance to that Dragon Breath weapon, or that Fireball spell, or whatever, while wild shaped really patches up weaknesses of wild shape and will increase your durability. This is one of those standard proficiency bonus uses abilities. For most characters, I would say skip this feat and get the Absorb Element spell instead. Though we should note that it's not an exact replica, because both provide resistance to acid, cold, fire, and lightning, but Absorb Elements includes thunder, and Gift of the Chromatic Dragon includes poison. I actually think poison is a far more common damage type, so unless you already have poison resistance built in somehow, you'll probably get more mileage out of this. This one, I think, is a feat that warrants serious consideration. So let's move on to some what I think are more obvious picks. Mobile. Not all our forms have great movement speeds, and we're mostly limited to melee options, so a flat 10 movement bonus to any movement type is beneficial. We can get a 1 hour 10-foot movement bonus with the Longstrider spell, but that might not extend over our entire wild shape duration, but the effects will stack when it does. Obviously, the big one though is our ability to move in, make our attacks, and then move out without requiring disengage. The tactical benefits of this while wild shaped should be self-apparent, but if you need a hint, look at your armor class in those forms. Crusher. So Crusher is just really nice with wild shape. Most of our forms do bludgeoning damage, And obviously, if you have this feat, then those are the forms that you should favor. Force movement is good. I think if you've watched my videos in the past, you already know my reasons for that. But also remember, we can cast a spell before we wild shape, and a lot of Druid spells just happen to work especially well with force movement. Spike Growth is the obvious one, but there's Transmute Rock, even Moonbeam shouldn't be ignored. Also, there's a good chance that other party members will add additional effects that combine nicely with force movement, like that Spirit Guardian spell that party member has up. Though I should note that force movement isn't always good. You need something to pair this up with. Here's where I really like this with Wild Shape though. The biggest limitation of Crusher, when used for force movement, is the size limitation, which limits the force movement to a target that is no more than one size bigger than you. Wild Shape Druids can, better than any other character, work around that limitation. Many of our best forms are large-sized, and some are even huge, which means we have a way to inflict this force movement to even gargantuan-sized targets. Then of course, the critical hit boost provides advantage on further attacks against the target until our next turn, and that's helpful as well. 3 of the 4 elemental forms do bludgeoning damage, by the way. Telekinetic. Yeah, so I'll repeat myself here, force movement is good. Telekinetic also gives you an ability score increase that is going to be relevant for your Druid character. I'll repeat myself again. Most of our wild shape forms don't have bonus actions, leaving that bonus action wonderfully free for using Telekinetic, which normally we would base on wisdom unless we're doing some kind of, funky multi-class build. Unlike Crusher though, this one is giving the opponent a saving throw, so I wouldn't be counting on this working, but it works enough. Warcaster. I mean, it's all about advantage on concentration saves, and that's really it. The holding a weapon and shield thing isn't going to apply, and we can't cast spells, so replacing opportunity attacks with spellcasting also doesn't apply. Though either of those might apply if we're not wild shaped. But in wild shape, you're likely concentrating on a spell, unless you've lost concentration, and Warcaster will help prevent that. Resilient, specifically Constitution. This one is probably the most obvious, but if you didn't multiclass your Druid to get Constitution saving throw proficiency right off the bat, then this is something I'd consider a must-have. Technically, the wild shape feature says that you get the saving throw proficiencies of the form you wild shaped into, so in theory, you could select forms that have Constitution saving throw proficiency. The thing is, that's almost nothing. Other than homebrew beasts or picking creatures from adventure paths, all you really have is the challenge rating 5 Brontosaurus. That means if you want to make concentration saving throws, this becomes the absolutely most optimal feat for a wild shape Druid. It's also the only feat on this entire list I would consider a must-have. So this one was a shorter video, but we'll get into more lengthy wild shape topics when we start talking about multiclassing and spells. And if you have any question, be assured I will be following up this series with builds based on the content. Builds, not build. So I hope you'll stick with me on this deep dive into wild shaping Druids. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.